A routine protective hearing seemed ordinary at first, until a jealous mistress crossed a line no one expected inside the courtroom. She believed power and arrogance would shield her, and she believed the pregnant woman standing there was weak. She had no idea who she was attacking, or who was watching from the judge's bench. Because this was not just a legal dispute. It was the moment violence exposed everything. What followed was a collision of rage, silence, and the law, where a single punch turned a civil hearing into a criminal reckoning, and justice moved in ways no one saw coming. Listen until the very end, because the truth will only be revealed in the final moment. And let us know where you are listening from and why you are here. Drop a comment below and join the story. Isabella Carter learned to recognize stress not as a sudden panic, but as a constant weight that never fully lifted. It followed her through each day, settled behind her eyes, tightened her chest, and made even ordinary decisions feel heavy. Pregnancy did not soften it, it sharpened everything. Her body carried new life, but her mind remained trapped in vigilance, always waiting for the next intrusion, the next message, the next reminder that peace was conditional. The pressure did not come from one place. It accumulated slowly, through repeated encounters and calculated words that never crossed into open threats, yet never allowed her to feel safe. Vanessa Moore knew how to operate in that space. She never shouted. She never needed to. Her presence alone was enough. A look held too long. A comment delivered with practiced calm. A reminder that Isabella was replaceable, that her marriage had already been hollowed out, that silence could be broken at any moment if Vanessa chose. Edward Kane watched all of it and did nothing. He did not intervene when the tension became visible. He did not correct Vanessa when her words cut too close. He did not set boundaries, and he never asked Isabella how she was holding up. His indifference became its own form of pressure. It signaled permission. It told Vanessa that there would be no consequences, no resistance, no moment where someone would step in and say enough. Isabella tried to endure it quietly at first. She told herself that stress was temporary, that pregnancy made emotions unpredictable, that once the baby arrived, things might stabilize. But the strain did not recede. Her sleep became shallow. Her appetite faded. Her doctor began to notice signs that could not be ignored. Elevated blood pressure, persistent anxiety, physical responses tied directly to emotional stress. The warning was clear. This environment was no longer safe. The moment Isabella decided to seek legal help did not come during a confrontation. It came during a quiet afternoon when she realized she was planning her movements around Vanessa's moods, calculating exits before entering rooms, and holding her breath when her phone vibrated. That realization carried clarity with it. This was not resilience. This was survival, and survival required action. Sarah Chen's office was calm in a way Isabella had not felt in months. The walls were bare of distractions, the desk organized with deliberate simplicity. Sarah listened without interruption as Isabella spoke, her voice steady but restrained, careful not to exaggerate, careful to remain factual. She described the pressure, the messages, the encounters that felt designed to remind her of her vulnerability. She described Edward's silence. She described how none of it left visible bruises, yet all of it left marks. Sarah did not dismiss any of it. She asked questions that focused on pattern and impact, not drama. When did it begin? How often did it occur? How did it affect Isabella's health? When Isabella mentioned her pregnancy, Sarah's attention sharpened. She asked for medical documentation. She explained calmly that psychological stress could carry legal weight, especially when it placed a pregnant woman at risk. They reviewed records together, messages, dates, notes from medical visits that referenced stress-related symptoms. Each piece on its own might have seemed minor. Together, they formed a consistent narrative: pressure, exposure, lack of protection within the home. Sarah explained the option clearly, without urgency but without hesitation. A request for a protective order, a civil remedy designed to establish boundaries before harm escalated. Isabella did not decide immediately. The idea of involving the court felt heavy. It felt like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. But as Sarah explained the process, Isabella realized that the line had already been crossed, just not by her. The law existed for moments like this, when warning signs appeared before catastrophe. She agreed to proceed. The petition was prepared with precision. It did not accuse without basis. It did not dramatize. It documented. It detailed the ongoing pressure, the emotional intimidation, the absence of intervention from her husband, and the medical assessment that indicated risk to her pregnancy if the situation continued unchecked. Sarah requested expedited consideration, citing both the pregnancy and the escalating pattern of distress. The court responded quickly. Within days, the request was reviewed and accepted for a protective order hearing. The scheduling was swift, signaling that the concerns were taken seriously. Notices were prepared. Summons were issued. The process moved forward with a momentum that surprised Isabella, even as it reassured her. Edward received the notice without visible reaction. He read it, folded it, and set it aside as if it were an inconvenience rather than a warning. He did not ask Isabella why she had filed. He did not acknowledge the gravity of the situation. His silence carried the same message it always had. This would pass. Money and influence would smooth it out. Courts were formalities, not threats. Vanessa reacted with disbelief, then irritation. She laughed when she learned she had been summoned, dismissing the idea that a civil hearing could matter. In her mind, the court was a stage where she would never be cast as the villain. She assumed Isabella was overreacting, that the system would recognize her weakness and move on. Both of them underestimated the process. Isabella spent the days leading up to the hearing preparing in quiet ways. She followed her doctor's advice carefully. She rested when she could. She reviewed the paperwork with Sarah, ensuring she understood each step. She did not rehearse speeches or imagine confrontations. Her goal was not to win, it was to be protected. The date of the hearing was confirmed and entered into the court calendar. It felt closer than expected, as if time had compressed around the decision she had made. Isabella noted the date and realized that for the first time in months, there was a defined moment ahead of her. Not just an endless stretch of uncertainty. She did not know who would preside over the hearing. She did not ask. To her, the judge was simply an authority, a neutral figure tasked with evaluating facts and issuing boundaries. She did not expect sympathy. She did not expect understanding beyond what the law required. What she expected was order. On the night before the hearing, Isabella prepared quietly. She laid out documents. She checked transportation arrangements. She rested her hands over her stomach and focused on steady breathing, reminding herself that the decision she had made was not an act of aggression, but of responsibility. She was no longer willing to absorb harm silently, especially when another life depended on her stability. The hearing was set. The notices had been delivered. The court would open its doors soon. None of them understood yet how much would change once it did. Isabella entered the courthouse with deliberate care, her pace slow and measured, guided by the quiet instructions of the medical aide beside her. The building felt colder than she expected, its wide corridors amplifying every sound, every footstep, every whisper that followed her movement. She was aware of her body in a way she had never been before, conscious of balance, breathing, and the steady presence of the life she carried. The support was not dramatic, only necessary, a visible acknowledgement that she was here under strain, not strength. Sarah Chen stayed close, her posture calm and controlled, her presence grounding. She did not rush Isabella or speak unnecessarily. Every motion signaled preparation and restraint. Sarah had already explained what would happen once they entered the courtroom, not in abstract legal language, but in practical terms: where to stand, when to speak, when silence mattered more than explanation. Isabella followed her lead without question. Edward Kane arrived separately. He walked in with the confidence of someone accustomed to formal spaces bending to his expectations. His expression was composed, almost distant, as though this appearance were an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. He did not look for Isabella immediately. He did not acknowledge the medical support at her side. His focus remained forward, detached, as if emotional distance alone could neutralize the gravity of the room. Vanessa Moore followed him, her demeanor sharply contrasted against the seriousness of the setting. She wore confidence like armor, her gaze scanning the courtroom with open appraisal. There was no sign of caution in her movements, no indication that she felt summoned by authority. Her expression held a trace of amusement, as though she expected the proceedings to confirm her assumptions rather than challenge them. As the courtroom filled, order was called without delay. Voices lowered, movements slowed, the air shifted into formality. Court officers ensured that everyone was seated properly, and the murmurs that had floated through the space faded into silence. The structure of the room imposed discipline without effort, reminding everyone present that this was not a place for posturing. Judge Robert Carter entered and took his seat at the bench with practiced ease. His presence was composed, professional, and restrained. To those in the room, he was simply the presiding authority, a neutral figure tasked with maintaining procedure. No one reacted beyond the customary signs of respect. No one recognized anything personal in his bearing, and nothing in his expression invited speculation. The hearing was called to order. Judge Carter's voice was even as he announced the purpose of the session. This was a civil matter, a protective order hearing requested by the petitioner. He outlined the scope of the proceedings clearly, emphasizing that the court was not there to assign criminal guilt, but to assess whether boundaries were required to prevent harm. The explanation was methodical, deliberate, and precise. There was no urgency in his tone, only clarity. Sarah Chen listened attentively, nodding slightly as the procedures were explained. Isabella stood quietly beside her, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her gaze lowered. She did not scan the room. She did not react to Edward's presence or Vanessa's posture. Her stillness was intentional, a conscious choice to remain within the role she had come prepared to occupy. The purpose of the hearing was stated plainly. The court would evaluate whether the petitioner faced ongoing risk that justified a protective order. The standard was preventative, not punitive. Judge Carter made it clear that emotional pressure, intimidation, and stress could be considered when supported by evidence, particularly when the petitioner was pregnant. The statement settled into the room with quiet weight. As the explanation continued, the atmosphere tightened. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her expression hardening. The procedural language, calm and unemotional, did not align with her expectations. She had anticipated dismissal, not acknowledgement. Each reference to protection and risk eroded her confidence, even if she refused to show it openly. Edward remained silent, his hands folded, his expression unchanged. He did not glance toward Isabella. He did not respond to Vanessa's shifting demeanor. His stillness read as control, but it also read as detachment. Whatever he felt, he chose not to display it. Judge Carter invited the petitioner to speak when appropriate, reminding the room that interruptions would not be tolerated. The rules were established early, not as a warning, but as a boundary. The courtroom responded accordingly, settling into attentive silence. Isabella did not speak immediately. She remained quiet, following Sarah's guidance precisely. Her role at this stage was presence, not performance. The documentation had already been submitted. The facts were already on record. Silence, in this context, was not weakness. It was discipline. The tension in the room grew as the reality of the hearing became undeniable. This was not a symbolic exercise. It was a structured evaluation, and everyone present understood that outcomes were possible. The air felt denser, as though expectation itself carried weight. Vanessa's discomfort became more apparent. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. Her gaze flicked toward Isabella, then away. She appeared restless, irritated by the formality, unsettled by the absence of immediate dismissal, being required to sit and listen, without the ability to dominate the narrative, pressed against her patience. Edward remained unchanged. His silence persisted, steady and opaque. He neither intervened nor distanced himself. His posture suggested that he believed restraint alone would suffice, that engagement was unnecessary, Judge Carter observed the room without expression. His attention moved methodically, taking in posture, behavior, and response. He did not linger on any one individual. His role was not to react, but to preside. As the hearing progressed toward its initial statements, the courtroom settled into a focused stillness. The formality of the process asserted itself fully. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of a legal proceeding that demanded attention. Every set of eyes eventually returned to the bench. Isabella remained quiet, exactly as instructed. Her breathing was controlled, her posture steady. She did not look toward Edward or Vanessa. She did not seek validation or reaction. Her presence alone communicated enough. Vanessa shifted again, her discomfort edging closer to irritation. The longer the silence stretched, the more it unsettled her. She was unaccustomed to environments where her confidence did not immediately translate into control. Edward stayed still. Judge Carter prepared to move the hearing forward. The balance in the room held for a moment longer, fragile and tense, waiting for the first words that would disrupt it. The shift began with a voice that did not belong in a courtroom. Vanessa Moore spoke without waiting for permission, her words cutting through the controlled silence with sharp precision. The tone was not loud, but it was deliberate, shaped to wound rather than persuade. She framed her remarks as commentary, not argument, choosing phrases that reduced Isabella's presence to inconvenience and exaggeration. Each sentence carried the implication that this hearing was unnecessary, that the woman standing there was fragile by choice, not circumstance. The reaction was immediate. Sarah Chen raised her hand and addressed the bench, her voice firm and measured, as she requested that order be maintained. She did not look at Vanessa when she spoke. Her focus remained forward, signaling that the interruption was procedural, not personal. The courtroom settled, but the damage lingered in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Isabella felt the words land before she processed them. Her body responded first, a tightening in her chest, a shallow breath that required effort to correct. She steadied herself and followed the guidance she had been given. When she spoke, it was only when invited, and her statement was brief. She did not accuse. She did not describe every incident. She did not look toward Vanessa or Edward. She spoke only to the court. She asked for protection. She stated that the pressure had become unmanageable, and that her priority was safety for herself and her unborn child. Her voice did not shake, but it carried strain. The restraint in her words made them heavier, not lighter. Judge Robert Carter listened without interruption. When Isabella finished, he acknowledged her statement and turned his attention back to the room. His instruction was clear. All commentary would remain relevant and controlled. Arguments would proceed through proper channels. Personal remarks would stop. Vanessa attempted to respond. The attempt was cut short. Judge Carter raised his hand and instructed her to stop. He informed her that she no longer had the floor. The decision was not dramatic. It was procedural, delivered with the same measured tone he had used throughout the hearing. Yet the effect was immediate and visible. Vanessa froze. For a moment, she appeared uncertain, as if recalculating. Then her expression hardened. The loss of the floor did not register as a technical ruling to her. It registered as exclusion. She had been removed from the center of attention, repositioned as peripheral, and denied the opportunity to frame the narrative. The feeling unsettled her. Edward Kane did nothing. He remained seated, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed forward. He did not reach for Vanessa. He did not speak. He did not intervene in any way that suggested concern or restraint. His silence did not de-escalate the situation. It allowed it to develop unchecked. Vanessa rose from her seat. The movement was abrupt enough to draw attention, but not yet enough to prompt immediate intervention. It was the kind of motion that hovered just within the boundaries of acceptability. Her chair scraped lightly against the floor as she stepped forward. Her focus locked on to Isabella. Court officers began to shift their weight, alert but not yet reacting. Vanessa took another step. The distance closed faster than anyone anticipated. The escalation was not announced. It was not preceded by shouting or threats. It happened in a vacuum created by disbelief. by the assumption that no one would dare cross such a line in a courtroom. Vanessa raised her arm. The punch landed with a sound that cut through the room. Isabella did not see it coming. The impact struck her face with sudden force, snapping her head sideways. Pain flared instantly, sharp and disorienting. She lost her balance and fell, her body folding as she hit the floor. Blood appeared immediately, bright against the neutral surface beneath her. The room erupted. Voices rose in alarm. Chairs shifted. Someone shouted. The formal order that had defined the space fractured into chaos. The sound of the impact lingered, echoing in stunned silence even as movement exploded around it. Court security reacted without hesitation. 2 officers reached Vanessa within seconds, seizing her arms and pulling her back. She resisted instinctively, her shock giving way to rage as she struggled against their grip. The restraint was firm and practiced. Her movement was halted decisively, her body controlled as she was turned away from Isabella. Edward stood frozen, his expression drained of composure, his mouth slightly open. He did not move toward Isabella. He did not shout. He did not attempt to explain or intervene. His stillness marked him as separate from the urgency unfolding around him, disconnected in a way that drew notice even amid the chaos. Isabella lay on the floor, stunned. Her senses struggled to catch up. The pain in her face pulsed, her ears rang. She became aware of the warmth of blood and the pressure of hands near her shoulders as people knelt beside her. She tried to move and stopped, instinct overriding impulse. Judge Carter stood. The motion was immediate and commanding. His chair pushed back as he rose, his presence asserting itself over the disorder. His voice cut through the noise, firm and authoritative, as he ordered the room to be secured and demanded that emergency protocol be initiated. The words carried weight. The chaos began to funnel into action. Security maintained control of Vanessa, holding her in place as she continued to react, her earlier confidence completely erased. The shift in her demeanor was stark. Whatever sense of control she believed she held had evaporated in the seconds following the punch. Edward remained where he was. The reality of what had occurred settled over him slowly, his earlier detachment replaced by visible shock. The consequences, once abstract, had become unavoidable. Isabella's breathing steadied as she focused on the voices around her. She registered Sarah's presence nearby, calm and directed despite the urgency. She felt the firm reassurance of someone instructing her not to move, not to speak, to stay still. The courtroom, moments earlier, bound by procedure, now stood at the edge of something irreversible. The punch had done more than injure. It had transformed the nature of the hearing itself. What began as a civil request had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. The boundaries of prevention had been shattered by violence, and the authority of the court had been challenged openly and publicly. Judge Carter remained standing, his attention fixed on the scene before him. The room obeyed his commands, settling into controlled urgency as order was restored piece by piece. The hearing was no longer what anyone had come for. The incident had moved it beyond its original purpose, carrying it into territory where consequences would be immediate and severe. Nothing in the room remained neutral. The moment had passed, but its impact remained, heavy and undeniable, as the courtroom prepared to confront what had just occurred. The courtroom shifted from chaos to protocol with abrupt precision. Court security moved first, not waiting for instruction, acting on training that required no hesitation. One officer spoke into a radio while another secured the immediate area. Emergency medical services were requested without debate, the call made clearly and calmly, as procedure dictated after an act of violence within the court. The doors to the courtroom were closed and locked. The sound carried finality. What had been a public hearing became a contained scene. Those inside were instructed to remain where they were, and movement was restricted to personnel with specific roles. The separation was intentional, designed to protect the injured and preserve order. Isabella lay on the floor where she had fallen, her position unchanged. She was conscious but disoriented, the pain in her face competing with a deeper, more urgent concern that tightened her chest. A court officer knelt beside her, speaking in a low voice, instructing her not to move. Isabella followed the guidance, focusing on breathing slowly, evenly. Resisting the instinct to shift, medical personnel arrived quickly. They approached with efficiency, assessing the scene before touching her. One knelt at her side, while another positioned equipment nearby. Their voices were calm and direct. They asked simple questions, confirming consciousness, orientation, and immediate symptoms. Isabella responded when able, her answers short and controlled. The first priority was stabilization. Blood was addressed immediately. A clean compress was applied to her face with steady pressure. The bleeding slowed under careful hands. The sensation was sharp but manageable, and Isabella concentrated on remaining still. She was instructed again not to move her head. A rapid assessment of her pregnancy followed. The medical team asked about pain, dizziness, and abdominal discomfort. They observed her breathing, her posture, and the tension in her body. The check was brief but thorough, designed to identify immediate danger rather than provide full evaluation. Isabella answered honestly, alert to every sensation, aware that this moment mattered beyond her own injury. Precautionary measures were taken. A cervical collar was placed to stabilize her neck. Her head was supported to prevent movement. The process was explained to her in simple terms before each step was taken. Nothing was rushed. The goal was safety, not speed. Sarah Chen remained close throughout. She stayed within view, maintaining communication with the medical team, relaying necessary information, confirming Isabella's identity, and ensuring that her client's condition was documented accurately. Her tone remained composed, even as the urgency of the situation pressed against the room. Across the courtroom, Vanessa Moore was restrained. Her wrists were secured with handcuffs as officers maintained control. The transition from aggressor to detainee was complete. Whatever protest she attempted carried no weight. The decision had already been made by her own actions. She was escorted away from the immediate area, still within the secured space, but separated from Isabella. Edward Kane was not allowed to approach. He was instructed to remain where he was and was held back by security personnel as initial questions were directed toward him. His role was no longer peripheral. His presence at the scene, his lack of intervention, and his proximity to the incident required attention. He did not resist, but he did not offer assistance either. His silence continued, now marked by visible strain. The medical team prepared to move Isabella. A stretcher was brought forward and positioned carefully beside her. Each movement was coordinated, deliberate, and explained before it happened. Isabella was guided onto the stretcher with support, her body kept aligned, her head stabilized throughout the transfer. She focused on breathing, following instructions, trusting the process. Outside the courtroom, an ambulance waited. Its presence had been arranged while care was being administered inside. The timing was precise, minimizing delay between stabilization and transport. Once Isabella was secured on the stretcher, she was moved through the cleared corridor, accompanied by medical personnel and court security. Sarah walked beside her. She remained with Isabella as they exited the courtroom, ensuring continuity and support. There was no discussion, no reassurance beyond presence. Words were unnecessary. The situation spoke for itself. Edward was stopped at the threshold. He was informed clearly that he would not be permitted to follow. The instruction was firm and final. This was not a negotiation. The separation underscored the shift in circumstances. Whatever access he had assumed no longer existed. The ambulance doors closed. Inside, Isabella was secured for transport. Vital signs were monitored. The medical team continued their assessment as the vehicle prepared to depart. The ride would take her to a hospital equipped to provide comprehensive evaluation, far beyond what could be done at the courthouse. The ambulance pulled away. Its departure marked a physical removal of Isabella from the scene, but the impact of what had occurred remained behind. The courtroom, now emptied of its central figure, felt altered. The energy that had defined it earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy, unsettled quiet. Inside, the room remained locked. Those still present stood in silence, the reality of the incident settling in. The procedural calm of the hearing had been replaced by the weight of consequence. No one spoke. No one moved without instruction. The hearing, as it had been conceived, was effectively over. What remained was documentation, control, and the acknowledgement that the boundary between civil process and criminal reality had been crossed. The absence of Isabella underscored the seriousness of that transition. As the courtroom emptied under supervision, the space felt stripped of its earlier purpose. The bench stood vacant, the chairs were unoccupied. The floor where Isabella had fallen was clean, but the memory of the moment lingered. The silence was not empty. It was charged, holding the unspoken recognition that something irreversible had taken place. When the last door closed and the room was left still, the truth of the situation began to surface. The protective hearing had not ended as planned. It had transformed, carrying consequences that would extend far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Judge Robert Carter returned to his chambers after the courtroom was cleared, the door closing behind him with a sound that marked separation rather than relief. The formal posture he had maintained throughout the hearing did not dissolve. He remained upright, deliberate, his expression unchanged. What shifted was not his demeanor, but his attention. It narrowed. He asked for the case file again. The request was ordinary in form, yet precise in timing. The clerk placed the documents on his desk, and Carter began to review them from the beginning, not scanning, not skimming, but reading with care. He focused on the petitioner's information, the sequence of filings, the medical attachments, the timeline that had led to the emergency response. Nothing appeared out of place at first. The facts were consistent. The documentation was thorough. Then the name caught his eye: Isabella Carter. The reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible. He did not pause. He did not lean back. He did not change pace. The name registered quietly, settling into memory rather than prompting immediate response. He continued reading, allowing the file to proceed as it had moments earlier, as if nothing had shifted. The date of birth followed. This time, the recognition was unavoidable. The date aligned with a record he had not accessed in years, one he had believed fully closed. The coincidence was too precise to dismiss. He did not react outwardly. He did not reach for any device or call for clarification. He simply noted it and continued reading. One detail remained: a personal marker included in the file for identification purposes. Not something broadly shared, not something that could be guessed. It was the kind of detail recorded once and then forgotten by everyone except those who had been present at the time. Carter recognized it instantly. There was no doubt. He closed the file slowly and sat still. Emotion pressed at the edges of his composure, but he did not allow it to surface. Years of discipline asserted themselves. Whatever this meant, it could not be processed impulsively. He reminded himself of the boundaries that defined his role. The court did not operate on instinct. It operated on verification. He summoned the clerk. His instructions were brief and neutral. He requested a formal verification of identity through official channels: birth records, adoption filings, any documentation that could confirm or deny what the file suggested. The request was framed as routine. No explanation was offered. The clerk accepted the task without question and began the process immediately. Outside the chambers, the consequences of the incident continued to spread. Edward Kane felt the shift first. The casual confidence he had carried into the courthouse no longer served him. The separation from Isabella, the visible restraint of Vanessa, and the presence of law enforcement had unsettled him. Now, as officers continued their preliminary inquiries, he began to understand that this was not a matter that would be resolved quietly. Questions were direct. Timelines were established. His responses were measured, but the weight of scrutiny pressed in. He realized that his silence during the incident was no longer neutral. It was being evaluated. Vanessa Moore experienced a different collapse. The environment that had once empowered her now constrained her completely. Handcuffs removed any illusion of control. Her earlier composure gave way to agitation, then anger. She spoke too quickly, contradicted herself, demanded recognition that no longer came. The authority she believed she held had vanished in seconds. Beyond the courthouse, information moved faster than procedure. News of the assault spread through official channels, then beyond them. The involvement of a pregnant petitioner transformed the narrative. Reports focused on the violence, the setting, the breach of courtroom security. The story took shape without embellishment. A civil hearing interrupted by assault, emergency response, a restrained suspect. Public attention followed. Within the system, the classification of the case changed. What had begun as a civil request was now accompanied by criminal considerations. The incident required separation of files, clear distinction between the protective order matter and the assault investigation. Carter issued instructions accordingly, ensuring that the records reflected the new reality. The procedural shift was necessary and immediate. He did not involve himself further than required. His role, for now, remained administrative. He awaited verification before acknowledging anything beyond the facts already established. The suspicion that had surfaced was contained, held in check by protocol. At the hospital, Isabella was placed under observation. Medical staff focused on stabilization and monitoring. The injuries she had sustained were addressed methodically. Imaging was ordered, vital signs were tracked, attention to the pregnancy was prioritized, with clear instructions to minimize stress and movement. The environment was controlled, quiet, designed to support recovery rather than alarm. Sarah Chen remained involved, coordinating information flow without overwhelming her client. She ensured that updates reached the appropriate parties and that Isabella was not burdened with unnecessary details. The legal process could proceed without her direct participation. For now, back in chambers, Carter waited. The clerk returned later with initial findings. Records were being retrieved. Cross-checks were underway. Nothing definitive yet, but the alignment was strong. The pieces were assembling with uncomfortable precision. Carter acknowledged the update and instructed the clerk to continue until confirmation was complete. He sat alone again, the file closed, his hands resting on the desk. He did not allow himself speculation. He did not imagine explanations. He focused on the responsibility in front of him. Whatever the truth was, it required proper naming, not assumption, not inference. Outside, the system moved forward. The assault investigation gained structure. The protective order request remained active, now reframed by urgency. Media coverage continued to build, careful but persistent. Edward and Vanessa faced separate realities shaped by the same event. Inside the courthouse, the waiting carried weight. Carter remained composed, his expression neutral, his actions measured. Suspicion, once ignited, did not dictate outcome. Verification did. The truth, when it arrived, would need to be addressed directly, without distortion or concealment. For now, it waited, suspended between record and recognition, demanding to be called by its proper name. The verification arrived without ceremony. Official records were delivered to Judge Robert Carter's chambers through standard channels, stamped, certified, and complete. There were no gaps, no missing pages, no need for interpretation. The documents aligned cleanly with the identifiers already reviewed. Dates, names, and registry entries converged into a single conclusion that required no explanation beyond acknowledgement. Carter read the confirmation once. Then he read it again, slower the second time, not searching for error but honoring procedure. The truth was now established through lawful means, not inference. Whatever weight it carried personally could not alter its status. It was verified. He did not call anyone immediately. He did not sit back or close his eyes. He remained still, absorbing the confirmation with discipline that had been trained over decades. The role he occupied demanded restraint. The law did not recognize hesitation, only action grounded in process. His first decision was one of containment. The confirmation would not be disclosed in open court. It would not enter the public record. There would be no announcement, no acknowledgement beyond what was required for compliance. The privacy of the parties involved, particularly the petitioner, required protection. Carter understood this instinctively and formally. He documented the decision. The clerk was summoned and instructed with clarity. The matter was to be treated as confidential, restricted to internal review and necessary counsel. No deviation, no discussion. The clerk acknowledged the instruction without reaction and proceeded accordingly. Carter's next decision followed immediately. He prepared the paperwork to recuse himself from the criminal proceedings related to the assault. The motion was precise, citing conflict of interest without elaboration. He did not reference personal connection. He did not justify. He followed the standard language required for such action. The recusal was submitted and accepted. Before stepping away, Carter addressed the remaining authority still within his scope. He reviewed and signed the final emergency orders connected to the protective request. These actions were within his jurisdiction and time-sensitive. He executed them without delay, ensuring that safeguards remained in place while the case transitioned. Once complete, he withdrew. The criminal case was reassigned to another judge without announcement. The transition occurred quietly, efficiently, and without public explanation beyond the standard notation of reassignment. The system absorbed the change without disruption. Isabella did not know. At the hospital, she remained under observation, focused on recovery rather than revelation. Medical staff monitored her condition and prioritized the stability of her pregnancy. She was shielded from unnecessary information, protected by both protocol and intent. The confirmation did not reach her, and no one attempted to share it. Sarah Chen was informed privately. The notification was handled with care. Carter communicated through appropriate channels, ensuring that legal counsel understood the confirmation and the boundaries surrounding it. Sarah listened without interruption, absorbing the implications with professional restraint. She did not ask questions beyond those necessary to clarify confidentiality and next steps. The truth was acknowledged, not acted upon. Sarah accepted the responsibility that came with the knowledge. She understood the importance of timing, of shielding her client from information that could destabilize her recovery. She confirmed compliance with the directive and returned her focus to the legal matters immediately at hand. Edward Kane remained unaware. No notification was sent. No hint was given. His attention was consumed by the growing consequences of the assault investigation and his own exposure within it. The absence of information kept him focused on defense rather than speculation. His ignorance was not accidental. It was deliberate. Vanessa Moore was taken into custody. Her detention followed standard procedure, processed without spectacle. The shift from courtroom restraint to formal confinement was swift. Charges were pending, but the direction was clear. The loss of control she experienced was total, defined by locked doors and recorded movements. The prosecution accepted the case file. The handoff was thorough. Evidence from the courtroom, medical reports, and security documentation were integrated into a cohesive package. The distinction between the protective matter and the criminal proceedings was maintained, each tracked independently while informed by the same incident. Medical documentation was expanded. Hospital records were updated with findings from ongoing evaluations. Observations were logged. Assessments were refined. The priority remained the health of the patient and the unborn child, with stress minimization emphasized at every stage. The documentation would serve both care and court, without intrusion. The criminal phase began. It did not announce itself with headlines or statements. It began with filings, assignments, and schedules. The machinery of prosecution engaged methodically, uninterested in spectacle. The assault had crossed a threshold, and the response reflected that reality. Within the courthouse, Carter returned to routine. He did not linger over the confirmation. He did not revisit the file. He maintained distance, both required and necessary. His recusal insulated the proceedings from conflict, preserving legitimacy for all involved. The truth existed, contained and controlled. It had been verified, acknowledged, and secured. It did not alter the process. It did not interrupt justice. It remained private, as intended, while the system continued forward. The law advanced without revealing family. Justice proceeded on its own terms, uninterrupted, guided by evidence and authority rather than personal revelation. The formal charges were filed in measured sequence, each document reflecting the gravity of what had occurred inside the courthouse. Vanessa Moore was charged first. The language was precise and uncompromising, identifying the act as a violent assault committed in a protected judicial setting. The location mattered. The presence of a pregnant victim mattered more. The filing left no ambiguity about intent or consequence. Edward Kane was charged separately. His indictment did not accuse him of striking a blow, but it did not excuse him either. Prosecutors identified his role as willful inaction. He was present. He had authority. He chose not to intervene. The charge framed his silence as complicity, not neutrality. The distinction was deliberate, grounded in the standard that responsibility does not end at restraint when prevention is possible. Two cases moved forward in parallel. They were connected by incident and evidence, yet separated by legal theory. One focused on direct violence. The other focused on abandonment and failure to act. The structure allowed each to be evaluated on its own merits, while preserving the shared context of the courtroom assault. The evidence was immediate and difficult to contest. Video recordings from the courthouse captured the sequence clearly. Timestamps aligned, angles confirmed proximity. The footage showed the approach, the strike, and the immediate collapse. There was no confusion about who moved or who stood still. The recordings did not dramatize. They documented. Security personnel provided sworn statements. Their accounts were consistent and procedural. They described the escalation, the response time, and the restraint. Each statement matched the footage without contradiction. There was no speculation in their language, only observation and action. Medical documentation followed. Hospital reports detailed the injuries sustained and the interventions required. Physicians noted the impact of the assault and the associated risks to the pregnancy. Stress indicators were documented alongside physical findings. The reports did not exaggerate. They established fact. The condition of the patient and the vulnerability of the unborn child were recorded with clinical clarity. The risk assessment elevated the case. Prosecutors emphasized that the assault did not occur in isolation. It occurred under circumstances that magnified harm: a pregnant victim, a controlled environment, a failure by those present to prevent escalation. Each factor added weight to the charges and informed the prosecutorial strategy. The prosecution assembled the indictments carefully. They outlined timelines, cited evidence, and defined roles. The narrative was straightforward and resistant to distortion. There was no reliance on inference when documentation sufficed. The case was built to withstand scrutiny rather than invite spectacle. Defense counsel struggled early. Attempts to reframe the events as spontaneous or provoked failed against the consistency of the evidence. The video contradicted minimization. The medical reports contradicted dismissal. The separation of charges limited deflection. Arguments that might have softened perception in another context found no traction here. Financial measures were imposed. Edward Kane's assets were subjected to court-ordered restrictions pending resolution. The action was preventative, designed to preserve accountability rather than punish prematurely. The impact was immediate. Accounts were frozen, transactions were halted. The reach of consequence extended beyond the courtroom into the infrastructure of his influence. Public awareness expanded rapidly. News coverage focused on the facts: the assault, the charges, the setting, the pregnancy. There was little room for alternative framing. The clarity of the incident limited speculation. Public response shifted accordingly, moving from curiosity to condemnation. Opinion turned. Support that Edward once relied upon eroded as the implications of his inaction became widely understood. Silence was no longer perceived as distance. It was interpreted as consent. Vanessa's actions were condemned without reservation, but Edward's role drew its own scrutiny, distinct and severe. Isabella remained in treatment. Her recovery continued under medical supervision, with emphasis on stability and reduced stress. Updates were managed through counsel to prevent intrusion. She did not participate in the prosecutorial process directly at this stage. Her health took precedence, and the system accommodated that necessity. The pregnancy stabilized. Physicians reported cautious progress. Monitoring continued. Instructions were clear: avoid stress, limit exposure. The priority was preservation. Legal proceedings adjusted around medical reality, not the other way around. Dates were set. The court calendar absorbed the cases and assigned timelines consistent with due process. The announcement was procedural, not theatrical. A date for trial was established, marking the transition from accusation to adjudication. The scheduling carried significance without ceremony. Within the justice system, the machinery moved steadily. No shortcuts were taken. No exceptions were granted. The separation of roles ensured that each defendant would face the charges appropriate to their actions. The parallel paths converged toward the same destination, shaped by evidence and law. The public waited. Expectations formed not from rumor, but from record. The clarity of the filings and the transparency of the process left little doubt about what lay ahead. The question was no longer whether accountability would come, but how it would be delivered. As the prosecutions advanced, the outcome moved closer. The cases were prepared, the evidence secured, and the timelines fixed. The stage was set not for argument, but for judgment. The courtroom was different this time. A new judge presided from the bench, unfamiliar to most of those present, selected precisely because distance now mattered. The change was procedural and necessary. Authority here would be exercised without history, without personal context, and without interruption. The room filled early. Seats were occupied in tight rows, and the aisles remained clear under watchful security. The public gallery carried a low hum that faded once order was called. Reporters settled behind their notebooks. Observers leaned forward. The weight of anticipation pressed into the space before a single word was spoken. Vanessa Moore entered first. She was brought in under restraint, her hands secured, her movement controlled by officers on either side. The image carried impact. The contrast between her current state and the confidence she once displayed was unmistakable. She did not look toward the gallery. She did not search for recognition. Her posture was rigid, her focus fixed straight ahead. Edward Kane followed separately. He took his seat without ceremony. Whatever influence he once believed he held no longer applied. His presence did not shift the room. It did not command attention. The legal posture he occupied was defensive, stripped of advantage by the evidence already filed. The prosecution began. The lead prosecutor addressed the court with measured clarity, outlining the charges and the framework under which they would be proven. The language was direct. The objective was not persuasion through emotion, but demonstration through record. The events would be shown in sequence. Responsibility would be assigned according to action and omission. The video evidence was introduced. Screens were positioned, and the footage played without commentary. The courtroom watched as the moments unfolded in silence. The approach, the sudden movement, the strike, the fall, the reaction. The recording captured angles that removed doubt. It did not linger. It documented. No one spoke while it played. When the video ended, the absence of sound felt heavier than any reaction. The clarity of the image left little room for interpretation. The act was visible. The failure to intervene was equally visible. Medical records were entered next. A physician read the findings into the record, focusing on injury assessment and subsequent care. The report detailed trauma to the face, immediate intervention, and continued observation. Attention then shifted to the pregnancy. The risks associated with the assault were explained in clinical terms, emphasizing vulnerability rather than speculation. The court listened. The testimony established that the danger extended beyond the immediate injury. Stress markers, elevated risk factors, the necessity of ongoing monitoring. Each point reinforced the seriousness of the act and its potential consequences. Witnesses followed. Court security officers testified in turn, confirming what had been recorded. Their statements aligned precisely with the footage. Timelines matched. Distances were confirmed. There were no discrepancies. Their professionalism underscored the reliability of the account. The defense attempted response. Counsel raised objections where possible, but each effort encountered the same obstacle. The evidence spoke for itself. Questions designed to introduce uncertainty fell flat against consistency. Arguments meant to soften perception failed to gain traction. The separation of charges limited diversion. There was no alternate narrative that fit the facts. The court acknowledged aggravating factors: the setting, the status of the victim, the presence of authority figures, the failure to de-escalate. Each element was recognized formally. The judge noted them for the record without emphasis, allowing their cumulative weight to stand on its own. Risk to the pregnant victim was addressed directly. The prosecution returned to the medical documentation and highlighted the specific dangers involved. The court accepted the explanation, recognizing that harm need not result in loss to be considered severe. Exposure to risk alone carried consequence under the law. Final arguments were presented. The prosecution summarized the case concisely, reiterating the evidence and the standards applied. There was no flourish. The closing emphasized responsibility, clarity, and accountability. The defense offered brief remarks, constrained by the record and limited in scope. The court recessed to deliberate. The pause was brief but tense. Those present remained seated, aware that the direction of the outcome was already apparent, even if the words had yet to be spoken. The silence carried expectation rather than doubt. When the court returned, the atmosphere shifted. The judge addressed the room, confirming that the evidence had been reviewed in full. The legal standards were restated. The findings were clear. The conduct had met the threshold for criminal liability. The aggravating circumstances were affirmed. The ruling approached. No sentence was delivered yet. That moment was still ahead. But the determination itself was unmistakable. The court's assessment left no ambiguity about culpability or consequence. Vanessa remained still. Edward lowered his gaze. The courtroom held its breath, not in hope, but in recognition. The process had moved beyond argument. Judgment now waited only for formal pronouncement. The verdict stood ready. What remained was delivery, and that would come next. The courtroom settled into silence as the judge returned to the bench. There was no anticipation of argument left in the room, only the expectation of consequence. Papers were aligned. The clerk stood ready. The gallery quieted without instruction, as though everyone present understood that this moment required restraint. Vanessa Moore was brought forward first. She stood restrained, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed ahead. The confidence that once defined her was gone, replaced by a tight stillness that betrayed the weight of what was about to be spoken. The judge addressed the record, confirming the findings already entered and restating the severity of the offense. The location of the assault, the vulnerability of the victim, and the risk created by the act were cited plainly. The sentence followed. Vanessa received a term of incarceration consistent with the gravity of the crime. There was no mitigation offered that altered the outcome. The judge emphasized accountability and deterrence, making it clear that violence within a court, especially against a pregnant individual, warranted the strongest response available under the law. The decision was delivered without raised voice or commentary, its authority resting in its finality. Edward Kane was addressed next. He approached the lectern under supervision, his demeanor subdued. The court acknowledged that he had not struck the blow, then moved immediately to what he had failed to do. The judge outlined the responsibility that accompanied his presence and authority at the time of the incident. His inaction was framed as enabling harm, a choice with consequences as real as any physical act. The sentence was imposed. Edward received a term of imprisonment for his role as an accomplice through abandonment. There would be no suspended sentence. There would be no alternative disposition. The court stated clearly that silence in the face of imminent harm carried liability when prevention was possible. The judgment left no room for reinterpretation. No probation was granted. The court confirmed that neither defendant would receive leniency through conditional release. The sentences were custodial and immediate. The clarity of the ruling extinguished any remaining speculation in the room. Financial orders followed. Edward's assets were addressed according to statute, subject to lawful processing and disposition. The measures were procedural and comprehensive, ensuring that accountability extended beyond confinement. The ruling emphasized compliance rather than retribution, grounding the decision in legal obligation. The judge then acknowledged the petitioner. Isabella Carter was permitted to appear briefly, as previously authorized. She entered with medical support, her movement careful and deliberate. A nurse remained close, attentive but unobtrusive. The room remained silent as she took her place, the presence of her condition understood without announcement. Isabella spoke once. Her statement was short and composed. She did not recount the events in detail. She did not address the defendants directly. She spoke about safety, about the necessity of boundaries, and about the importance of protecting life. Her words carried weight because they were measured, focused on outcome rather than emotion. She did not mention family. The court did not invite it, and she did not offer it. The matter before the court was resolved on evidence and law, not personal revelation. The restraint reinforced the integrity of the process. The judge acknowledged her statement and closed the record. The courtroom remained still. For several seconds, no one moved. The gravity of the decision settled across the benches and the gallery alike. The silence was not empty, it was affirming, a collective recognition that the process had reached its conclusion. Media representatives noted the rulings quietly. There were no shouted questions, no interruptions. The clarity of the judgment left little to ask. The facts had been addressed. The consequences had been delivered. Reporting would reflect record rather than reaction. Public response followed swiftly. Outside the courtroom, commentary aligned with the ruling. The acknowledgement of harm, the rejection of leniency, and the emphasis on protection resonated broadly. The decision was not controversial. It was accepted. The case was closed. Procedurally, the files were marked complete. Appeals, if any, would proceed through separate channels. But the matter before the court had been concluded. The judgment stood as entered, binding and enforceable. Isabella was escorted out safely. Security coordinated her departure, ensuring a clear path and minimal exposure. She did not linger. She did not pause for cameras. Her exit was calm, controlled, and protected. The medical support remained with her until she reached her transportation. The defendants were removed in turn. Their departures were orderly and silent, guided by officers trained to move matters forward without spectacle. The contrast between their exits and Isabella's was stark, defined by circumstance rather than commentary. Inside the courtroom, the judge rose. With the formalities completed, the session ended. The bench was cleared. The doors opened. The room began to empty, returning slowly to neutrality after the weight of judgment. What remained was resolution. The law had acted. Accountability had been imposed. Protection had been affirmed. The purpose of the process had been fulfilled without excess or omission. Beyond the courthouse, life continued. Isabella's focus returned to recovery and care. Medical oversight remained in place, attentive to stability and progress. The unborn child remained protected, shielded by both medical vigilance and legal boundary. The sentence marked an end, not an erasure. The consequences would unfold in time, but the decision itself stood complete. The courtroom had spoken, and its words carried forward, firm and final. Life did not stop after the verdict. It moved on, grounded by justice and sustained by protection. Recovery did not arrive as a dramatic turning point. It came quietly, shaped by routine and care rather than revelation. Isabella continued her pregnancy under close medical supervision, attending regular appointments and following clear guidance. Each visit confirmed stability. Each result reinforced the same message. She was safe, the child was safe. That assurance became the foundation upon which everything else rested. The world beyond the hospital moved on without her involvement. Edward Kane's influence dissolved quickly. Once the sentences were carried out, positions were vacated, access was revoked. Networks that had once responded to his presence adjusted without ceremony. Power that depended on visibility proved fragile when removed from public reach. What remained was accountability, enforced without exception. Vanessa Moore faced a different reality. Inside confinement, there was no audience and no narrative to control. The conditions were plain and regulated. Days followed structure. Consequences were immediate and unavoidable. The identity she had relied upon offered no protection there. Whatever certainty she once carried confronted the limits of confinement and time. For Isabella, distance was intentional. She did not follow updates. She did not seek confirmation of suffering or regret. Her attention remained on recovery, on preparation, on the steady rhythm of life that continued forward. Justice had already done its work. There was nothing more she needed to witness. The conversation that mattered most happened privately. It did not occur in a courtroom or an office. It took place away from attention, measured and restrained. The truth of parentage was spoken quietly, acknowledged without performance. There was no announcement and no correction to the public record. The understanding belonged to those involved and no one else. The decision to keep it private was mutual. There was no advantage in disclosure and no need for validation. The law had functioned as intended without interference. Personal matters remained personal. Boundaries were respected because they were necessary, not because they were demanded. Isabella did not feel anger. She did not revisit grievances or assign blame beyond what had already been addressed through legal process. Her focus was forward. Forgiveness was not a requirement, and neither was resentment. What mattered was safety, clarity, and the absence of threat. The judge maintained appropriate distance. There were no special allowances and no continued involvement beyond what had already been completed. Professional boundaries remained intact. Respect was preserved through restraint, not proximity. The separation protected everyone involved and upheld the integrity of the system that had already delivered justice. Within the family, healing began slowly. It did not take the form of celebration or reunion. It appeared in small gestures and steady presence. Support was offered without pressure. Conversations remained practical and grounded. The emphasis was on stability rather than reconciliation. Isabella made a clear decision regarding her marriage. The choice to pursue a lawful separation followed process rather than emotion. Documentation was prepared. Steps were taken deliberately. The decision was not framed as retaliation or escape. It was presented as a conclusion, necessary and final, grounded in safety and responsibility. There was no pursuit of vengeance. The desire to punish had already been addressed by the court. Anything further would have diluted the purpose of the outcome. Isabella understood that justice did not require ongoing conflict. It required closure. That closure arrived through consistency. Days passed without interruption. Appointments were kept. Planning continued. The future took shape through ordinary choices rather than dramatic turns. Each decision reinforced autonomy and stability. The unborn child became a symbol without being burdened by meaning. There was no expectation placed upon that life beyond care and protection. Hope did not require explanation. It existed naturally, sustained by the absence of fear and the presence of support. Life was rebuilt through intention. Routines were established. Spaces were reclaimed. The rhythm of daily activity replaced the uncertainty that once defined every interaction. The transition was not sudden, but it was real. The public narrative faded. Media attention moved on as it always does. Without new developments, interest declined. The case entered record and reference rather than conversation. What remained was the precedent and the clarity of consequence. Isabella did not look back. Her progress was measured not by distance from the past, but by confidence in the present. Each step forward affirmed the same truth. Protection had been secured. Boundaries had been enforced. The system had responded when it mattered. The story closed without spectacle. There was no final confrontation and no lingering question. The resolution was complete because it did not depend on recognition or approval. It depended on outcome. Justice had been sufficient. It did not require repetition or reinforcement. It stood on its own, supported by process and upheld by consequence. What followed was life, a life shaped by care, guarded by boundaries, and grounded in safety. The chapter ended not with declaration, but with continuity. The protection remained.